consolidation means for small business. In this subcommittee, we look at a lot of different procurement tools and have always been careful to say that no one type of contracting methodology is inherently good or bad. But that is how government uses a tool, how the government uses a tool that matters. In no case is it truer than in bundling and in consolidation. In the Small Business Act, Congress tells agencies how to determine whether bundling and consolidation are whether or not they're being appropriately used. The law provides definitions of the methodologies, explains what benefits would justify the use of the strategy, and requires agencies to mitigate justified bundling and consolidation, and prohibits unjustified bundling and consolidation. When bundling and consolidation are justified, they deliver real benefits to the taxpayer. However, unjustified bundling unnecessarily excludes small businesses from competing for federal contracts, which result in higher prices for taxes. Thus, this system only works if agencies correctly identified contracts as bundled and consolidated. While we don't have all the data yet, agencies are reporting bundling of 38 contracts worth $2.8 billion in FY13 and consolidating another 98 contracts worth $29 billion. This would mean that about 6% of the dollars we spend are bundled or consolidated, and that amounts to 136 of 10 million plus contracts awarded that were actually bundled. Unfortunately, we know this number is significantly underreported. For example, during our June hearing on strategic sourcing, we heard that agencies are turning more and more to consolidating and bundling contracts for goods and services normally procured from small businesses. However, this strategic sourcing contracts are not being reported as bundled or consolidated. Likewise, while agencies did not award all of the top 20 contracts predicted for FY 2013, of those awarded, none included a bundling or consolidation. None included a bundling or consolidation justification, even though these contracts were expected to exceed $105 billion. While it is easy to point out large omissions, it is often the smaller contracts, those in tens or hundreds of million dollars that represent the greatest loss of opportunity for small business. I hope to hear from our witnesses today on how large this problem is, what we can do about it, and frankly, at this time, to see what consequences we might apply to the agencies and how we can correct this circumstance. Further, I'm concerned other aspects of the law are not being enforced. For example, after a bundling contract is awarded, the government is supposed to report back on the anticipated savings or benefits that justified the bundling and explains what those benefits were. To date, not one such report has been completed. I'm hoping our witnesses today will help us understand the scope of the problem, what we need to do to get reliable data on bundling and consolidation. I'm also looking for their ideas to hold agencies accountable for unjustified bundling and consolidation, since the current statutory provisions are being observed in the breach. Finally, I am seeking their opinions on other ways we can improve the law to ensure that small businesses have a piece of this pie. At a time when we are focused on the financial health of the country, I believe that part of the solution is to find ways to improve competition and thereby reduce prices. Small businesses are a critical part of that solution, since their participation in competition creates jobs, encourages innovation. I look forward to your testimony, and thank you all again for being here today. I turn to my friend, Ms. Meng, Grace Meng, ranking member, for her opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Today, small businesses are looking for opportunities to expand and to grow stronger. As a catalyst for nearly 2/3 of employment gains, small business expansion is essential for the economy. One way Congress can increase the job-creating power of small firms is through the federal procurement marketplace. In fact, during the last decade, the government has doubled its contracting efforts to more than $500 billion per year. This makes the U.S. government one of the largest single buyers of goods and services in the world. In order to ensure that small firms successfully compete for these federal contracts, several tools and resources have been put in place. This includes the 23% small business procurement goal, as well as protections that help level the playing field for smaller enterprises. Programs at the Small Business Administration provide a foundation for many entrepreneurs to enter the federal marketplace and provide a springboard for growth. Together, these goals, policies, and programs have encouraged agencies to recognize that small businesses can provide high-quality goods and services at a competitive price to the taxpayer. For many small firms, however, these resources are simply not enough to overcome one of the biggest hurdles they face, contract bundling. Although we must be cognizant of the cost to federal agencies, we must ensure that bundling does not limit the accessibility of small businesses to federal contracts, especially while the government is falling short of its 23% goal. Last year, more than $50 billion, or 10% of total contracting dollars, was awarded through bundled or consolidated contracts. As a result of bundling, small businesses missed out on contracting opportunities worth more than $15 billion. By bundling large contracts such as these, the government effectively shuts out many smaller companies from competing for work that they have the skills and the expertise to perform. Splitting these mega contracts into smaller pieces would enable more small businesses to compete for federal agency work. By doing so, the government would be able to increase competition, accessing qualified companies and the high-quality service they bring to the table. At the forefront of this battle are procurement center representatives, small business specialists, and procurement technical assistance centers, whose already depleted ranks have been further reduced by sequestration. Unfortunately, they are fighting an uphill battle. Last year, SBA's PCRs challenged just 28 bundled contracts out of more than 17 million contracting actions, and only 6 were actually unbundled. This is simply not enough oversight to make a difference. Ensuring that these bundled and consolidated contracts are more thoroughly examined is critical to giving small businesses an equal opportunity in this marketplace. These challenges, while significant, pale in comparison to the impact that the shutdown is having on small business contractors. With the government typically spending $1.4 billion on contracts per day, the shutdown is causing severe disruption and confusion for small businesses. For many firms, it is unclear when they will be paid for their work, which in turn is causing uncertainty for their employees. In 2012, my district received an average of $117,000 a day, or $2 million a month, in loans from the SBA. These loans are not being processed. As a result, small businesses are left without access to the opportunities and resources they have come to depend on for their livelihood. Given the shutdown, I'm not only looking forward to testimony about contract bundling today, but also concerning the impact that the government's closure is having on our small firms. I'm hopeful that we can reopen the government and in the future take steps to reduce the prevalence of bundling across federal agencies. With that said, I want to thank all of the witnesses in advance of their testimony again and their input on these important issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. It's my job to explain the lights. It's a little like your stewards explaining how the seatbelts work. So red is bad, green is good. We're pretty flexible, so we want to hear what you have to say. In any event, our first witness today is Juanita Buford. Juanita, thank you. Buford, President of the Association of Procurement and Technical Assistance Centers, called PTACs, and Director of the University of Delaware PTAC program. There are currently 94 PTAC programs across the country operating at 300 locations. And these individuals assist small businesses with federal contracting, as Ms. Buford is uniquely situated to speak to the experience of small contract of bundling in small businesses and consolidation. Ms. Buford, thanks for being here, and you may begin.
Thank you. Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Ming, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm honored to speak before you on behalf of the Association of Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, APTAC, and the small businesses we serve, and to express our gratitude for your leadership on their behalf. As you said, my name's Juanita Buford, president of APTAC and the professional organization of now 97 procurement centers nationwide. Created by Congress in 1985, PTACs assists local businesses at little or no cost by preparing them to become capable government contractors, believing that a broad base of small business suppliers provide the highest quality and best value to our government while creating a strong and vibrant economic base for our communities. Last year, we helped over 70,000 small businesses win more than 112,000 government contracts valued at over $14.1 billion. We applaud your efforts to re-examine the issue of bundling and consolidation. Many of our members report frustration about dwindling bid opportunities as agencies increasingly rely on large acquisition mechanisms such as strategic sourcing, government-wide acquisition contracts, multi-agency contract, omnibus single solution contracts, and multiple-year indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, as well as bundling and consolidation. There's a clear perception that the number of solicitations appropriate for small businesses is shrinking significantly, while small businesses are additionally disadvantaged by the lack of access to contracting officers and a trend away from best value trade-offs and towards lowest price technically acceptable. We cannot quantify the extent to which perceptions are accurate. As you know, the data is incomplete and difficult to find, and we hear little about efforts to challenge or mitigate consolidation practices. Agencies strive to be good steward over tax dollars, often with underfunded acquisition offices. Streamlined vehicles are attractive because they're easy and promise cost savings. I suspect there is confusion both about what constitutes bundling and that there are requirements to make solicitations accessible to small businesses. Enforcement of such requirements is simply not happening in many cases. Simplifying definitions could be an important place to start. Having different definitions for bundling and consolidation is itself difficult. Select one term and define it simply. For example, two or more requirements that would reasonably be provided or performed under two or more separate contracts. To bring this under the umbrella, all vehicles that present barriers to small businesses while making communication about and measurement of the issue easier. Then define the criteria under which consolidated contracts may be appropriate or require review or justification. This would make clear the newer mechanisms such as strategic sourcing, GWACs, etc. Indeed constitute consolidation solicitation, which is the first step in determining their prevalence and impact. Simplifying the reporting process and identifying a better platform for making the information available to PCRs and the public could also be helpful. And we've included an example in our addendum to our written testimony. Also intended to provide accountability, it appears that requirements are often sidestepped. This information must be tracked and analyzed so that effective strategies for protecting the ability of small businesses to participate in the federal marketplace can be developed and implemented. Defining realistic enforcement triggers and providing adequate resources to implement them is also critical. The fact that enforcement actions are rare undermines existing regulations. But the real challenge is to convince government buyers that their interests can be well served by small businesses. To this extent, we encourage the subcommittee to consider initiatives to educate agency acquisition staff about statutory and regulatory provisions with regards to bundling and consolidation, while emphasizing the importance of a robust base of small business suppliers and the specific benefits small businesses can bring to agency requirements. Contracting officers may not be aware of these benefits, much less best practices for accessible contract vehicles and small business outreach. There are success stories out here. Highlighting them while training contracting officers on how and why to contract with small businesses could be critical to overcoming the trend towards consolidation. Buying from small businesses must be seen as an appealing option. To the extent that APTAC or the PTACs can help, please call upon us. PTACs are proud to collaborate with local federal offices, and APTAC has partnered with agencies for national outreach. We would gladly work with additional agencies to open more opportunities to small businesses. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second witness is Robert A. Burton. Mr. Burton is a senior partner in Venable LLP in Washington, D.C., where he is a nationally recognized federal procurement attorney. Prior to joining Venable, Mr. Burton spent 7 years at the Office of Federal Procurement, serving as Deputy Administrator as well as Acting Administrator for 2 years. Mr. Burton, thank you for being here.
Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Ming, and members of the subcommittee, I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify today and discuss how contract bundling and consolidation remain difficult challenges for small businesses and why increased congressional oversight is needed. Prior to joining the Venable law firm in 2008, I did serve as the Deputy Administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, oftentimes referred to as OFPP. While serving this capacity, I worked on initiatives to increase contracting opportunities for small businesses and assisted with the development of the 2002 Office of Management and Budget Report on contract bundling, which ultimately resulted in amendments to the Federal Acquisition Regulation and the regulations issued by the Small Business Administration. The bundling report was part of the President's Small Business Agenda and focused on increasing agency reporting on bundled contracts and mitigating the negative effects of justified bundling on small businesses. The 2002 report also resulted in the regulatory requirement for bundling reviews of task orders under the GSA schedules and other multiple award contract vehicles, which was a significant step forward because the majority of our Federal procurement dollars are actually awarded through task orders under umbrella contracts. In my testimony today, Mr. Chairman, I would like to focus on 3 factors that, in my view, have undermined the effectiveness of the regulations and the laws passed by Congress that were intended to mitigate the effects of contract bundling and contract consolidation. Now, these 3 factors are: 1, the lack of accurate and reliable data on bundled and consolidated contracts; 2, the lack of agency accountability for not following applicable laws and regulations on this subject; and 3, the lack of recourse for small businesses harmed by unjustified contract bundling or consolidation. With respect to the first issue, the unavailability of accurate data, it appears that agencies simply have failed to report their use of bundled requirements as required under the procurement regulations. Indeed, the SBA website that tracks agencies' bundling reports, which must be filed on an annual basis, does not provide any reports for fiscal year 2010. Further, many agency websites do not maintain a list of bundled procurements as required under the 2010 Small Business Act amendments. And finally, by statute, the Federal Procurement Data System, otherwise known as FPDS, must collect data regarding bundling of contract requirements when the contract price exceeds $5 million, including all options. However, the FPDS data is unreliable and incomplete, primarily because of lack of agency reporting and differing agency interpretations and applications of the word bundling. The second factor is the agency's failure to comply with the bundling and consolidation regulations. This failure is nowhere more apparent than in the agency's failure to prepare the required written justification for both contract bundling and consolidation as mandated by law. For example, just recently, I had a client who was one of 5 small businesses that provided a specific set of services to a Federal agency. The agency decided to recompete their contract and converted a multiple award contract into a single award contract. All 5 incumbents lost the recompete, which has had a significant negative impact on their financial health. The agency's justification for the single award consolidated contract was requested, but my understanding is the agency never prepared a justification analyzing the potential negative impact that consolidation might have on small businesses. In similar consolidation cases that I have personally worked on, the agencies have simply been unable to provide the required written justification for the bundling or consolidated procurement. Finally, I would like to address the third factor that, in my opinion, has hindered the implementation of the bundling and consolidation regulations. This is the lack of recourse for small businesses that have been negatively impacted by agency noncompliance with the applicable regulations. In this regard, I recommend that Congress provide for an independent review of agency contract bundling and consolidation actions. This review should be conducted by an independent review board or office within the government, which does not have any incentive to justify unsupported agency contract consolidations. Arguably, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, may be the best position to provide this type of unbiased and independent review. This administrative review should be separate from the formal bid protest reviews currently conducted by GAO and should be housed in a different GAO office. At a minimum, third-party independent reviews will highlight the fact that most agencies are not preparing the required justifications for bundled or consolidated procurements. Moreover, this type of review is critical in the face of the growing trend toward consolidation through new government-wide strategic sourcing contracts and related initiatives. In conclusion, I think it is evident that agency noncompliance with the bundling and consolidation laws and regulations will simply require increased congressional oversight. This is critical to ensure that small business participation in the Federal procurement process is protected and that agencies justify the growing number of contract consolidations. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement, and I will be pleased to answer any questions that you or members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third witness today is Ms. Gloria Berthold Larkin, testifying on behalf of Women Impacting Public Policy, or WIP, where she serves as Educational Foundation Vice Chair. WIP is a nationally nonpartisan public policy organization advocating on behalf of its coalition of 4.7 million businesswomen. Ms. Larkin is also president of Target Gov, a company that helps small businesses sell to government customers. Ms. Larkin, thank you for being here, and you may begin.
Thank you, Chairman Hanna, and Ranking Member Meng, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Gloria Larkin, and I am president of Target Gov, and I also serve as the vice chair of the Educational Foundation of Women Impacting Public Policy. I have been in business since 1997, and my firm helps companies of all types pursue, propose, and win Federal government contracts. As a result, we do have specific experience in challenging world of bundled and consolidated contracts. I am here today representing Women Impacting Public Policy, or WIP, a national nonpartisan public policy organization advocating on behalf of its coalition of 4.7 million businesswomen nationwide, including 75 business organizations. WIP plays a key role in developing women-owned businesses into successful government contractors through our Give Me 5 and Challenge Her programs. In our view, bundling and consolidation continues to hamper small business in the federal marketplace. We believe that contracts that can be serviced by small business should not be subject to any form of consolidation. It is our recommendation the following actions be taken to minimize unnecessary and unjustified consolidation. First, would like to improve the collection of statutorily required data on consolidation. Second, complete the related regulatory actions. And 3, increase training and outreach to small businesses vendors. What are these actual barriers to success? According to WIP members, these are the key reasons that they are wary of pursuing these large contracts. First, it is the time and cost required. It is not unusual for large businesses to invest nearly $250,000 in preparation to win these government contracts. The timeline is equally large. Vendors must enter the market 12 to 18 months ahead of time before the contract is actually competed. At that same time, small businesses must choose between going to vendor outreach or industry days or making money on their existing contracts so that they can simply pay their employees. Second, size and bonding questions are major concerns. As an example, let's take an engineering firm with a size standard of under $14 million in annual revenue. Let's say they're pursuing a consolidated contract worth $100 million as a prime contractor. They're unlikely to win because federal government requires that they show past performance of a similar size contract. If they could do a $100 million contract, they would not be small business. Bonding requirements present similar barriers. As these consolidated contracts increase in size, far exceeding the size standard for small business, there is only one real alternative to competition, and that's teaming. But teaming itself is fraught with cost, risk, and dangers to all parties. The costs involved in teaming must be borne directly by the small business, and those costs are not allowable in the contract accounting process. And third, winning does not mean that you have actually won anything. Should a business or a team be successful and actually win a bundled contract, it is only the first step. No money is actually paid on products or services until each awardee further pursues individual task orders on a competitive basis. Therefore, the winners have simply won the right to compete over and over and over again with other winners. The growth of consolidated contracts essentially forced small businesses to form complicated teaming agreements with a wide variety of partners. All told, these enormous bundled contracts inherently limit small business from competing. I'll wrap up with WIP's following recommendations to the committee. Number 1, improve the collection and sharing of bundled data. It seems to be a common thread here. To be honest, I don't think we actually know how much bundling and consolidation is really happening, and that can't be good for anyone. Let's complete the regulatory process for bundling regulation. We do applaud SBA's recent October 2nd final rule, but my understanding is that it could take years to implement, even after FAR Council adoption. And number 3, let's increase education efforts of small business vendors regarding the consolidation and bundling process. More partnerships are needed between agencies and our business community. As new rules and regulations are released, small businesses need to understand the consolidation process, as well as the appeal and protest processes for possibly unjustified or unnecessary consolidations or bundlings. It is our hope that our identification of these barriers and recommendations are helpful to your efforts to assist small businesses to become successful federal contractors, thereby supporting the economy with the jobs across the nation that we desperately need right now. Thank you, and I am very happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I now yield to Ranking Member Mang to introduce minority witness.
It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Margot Dorfman. Ms. Dorfman is the founder and CEO of the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce. The Women's Chamber represents 500,000 members, three-quarters of whom are small business owners and federal contractors. Through her leadership, this organization has championed opportunities to increase women's business, career, and leadership advancement. Additionally, Ms. Dorfman has extensive background in business, including over 10 years in executive positions with General Mills and other Fortune 500 firms. Welcome, Ms. Dorfman.
Thank you. And Chairman Hanna, Ranking Member Meng, and members of the subcommittee, I greatly appreciate being here today, and I am here to testify on behalf of the U.S. Women's Chamber of Commerce and the millions of women that we represent across the United States, along with our 500,000 members, three-quarters of whom are American small business owners and federal contractors. Whenever I'm asked to provide testimony on key issues impacting business, I first go directly to our members to receive boots-on-the-ground input. Here's what I heard this week. From Eileen Penetier, Comprehensive Environmental, the Air Force periodically puts out worldwide environmental contracts encompassing almost all of their environmental work. Given the size of these bundled solicitations, they are unattainable for small businesses. Jennifer Dickerson of NREP, the Department of Energy continues to bundle scopes of work, stating they do not have the resources to manage smaller contracts and that the risk is too great. If smaller scope of work is not segregated out, DOE will continue to receive an F grade from the SBA in meeting their small business goals. There is not accountability by the SBA, the DOE, the primes, and unfortunately the small business contractors suffer. Cheryl London with Chairco. Because of bundling, we have been precluded from any profitable business that the government has for our type of work. The jobs are contracted out by agency and facility and cover any aspects of construction at those facilities, often for years. Lynn Sutton of Advantage Builder Contractors. The projects we choose to pursue is the most important decision we can make for our business. This economy has left few standing. Bundling contracts is an extreme hardship, especially for the construction industry. And I have another member. Contract bundling is more expensive than direct contracting. Fee, G&A, and engineering hours are added to the prime's contract to, quote-unquote, manage the sub. The sub was working independently and directly with the government prior to the bundling at a lower total cost. While this committee has been active in seeking to eradicate bundling and consolidation of federal contracts, our members make it clear the issues of bundling, consolidation, and the ever-popular euphemism strategic sourcing are alive and well in the federal marketplace due in part to the following. One, there is a systematic lack of accountability in federal contracting. Year after year, the federal government misses the required 23% mark and also the paltry 5% goal for women-owned firms, and does nothing to end the charade of what acquisitions get counted as eligible for small business target, underfunds the procurement center representatives, and fails to hold senior acquisition and agency leaders accountable for the systemic failures. Two, congressional leaders fail to understand that bundling and consolidation actually represent decreased competition, as many competitive vendors are left out due to the size and scope of single competition. Three, now we have legislation and rulemaking that claims to be the solution for ending bundling and consolidation. But when we look at it from our view, these rules simply detail the basis for providing a legal paper trail to justify bundling and consolidation. And four, posting an agency's intent to bundle or consolidate 30 days ahead of publishing the offer may look like transparency and may make for a nice rebuttal to complaints, but if you're trying to be a small business, keeping up with yet another federal website, taking on an agency at the last minute, potentially incurring legal fees, and potentially running agency-level relationships or ruining them, then when agency acquisition leaders have made their strategic plans long ago. This is simply just not feasible. If you truly want to prevent bundling and consolidation, then just say no rather than provide the blueprint for how to justify it. increase the number of and clout of the procurement center representatives, get more influence at the agency's strategic planning stage, require the SBA to provide annual reporting that goes much further than the woefully inadequate small business goaling reports. And last but certainly not least, stop shutting down the government. I guarantee you the sudden stops and starts, the lack of certainty in agency funding, and the lack of accountability that follows this sort of mess will absolutely lead acquisition professionals to do whatever they can to just let out contracts as fast as possible to all the big businesses lined up at their doors ready to take our tax dollars as fast as possible. And while I'm on the subject of shutdowns, you need to stop this nonsense. You are killing our businesses. Our members were just getting their feet on the ground, and you pulled the rug out again. My members have started laying off employees already. They have no way to recover the cost of the lost revenues from the shutdown. You are hurting their businesses, you're hurting their families, you're hurting their employees' families, and you're hurting, ultimately, their local economies. I ask that you stand down and open the government today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I appreciate your frankness. We have almost unanimity here, so that's also nice. I'm going to give Mr. Benevidio, let me get this right, Bentivolio.
Thank you.
First crack at this, and you may begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. It's very important, specifically since I went back to my district not long ago and talked to some businessmen business folks who said that the government gave a big contract to an organization and they couldn't bid on that, even though they originally were part of the bidding process, but they were shut out. And then they had a product that they could make cheaper, better quality, but they weren't authorized because the general contractor didn't, I guess they didn't meet those qualifications for that general contractor. And my question is, I guess, does the general contractor get to pick and choose who he wants? Basically, I mean, we like to think they go to the lowest bidder, but that's not always the case. It would be naive to think so, right? So what I'm asking, I guess, is the government has protocols for giving minorities preference, veterans preference, those kinds of things. But when it goes to a general contractor, are they still obligated, or can they follow their own rules, make up their own rules? Anybody?
I could speak to our members and their experience in this. Essentially, what often happens is for the prime contractor has to come up with a subcontracting plan to include the women, minorities, whatever the goals are. Once they go get the contract, they come back. They often take that work in-house and do not use the firms that they had go through a very expensive process of providing them a quote of how much the work would do.
Wow. Yeah, I can see your point. I can see your point. It's pretty unfair. Mr. Burton, I had a question for you, but I can't remember exactly what it is, but I got the impression somebody said something about strategic sourcing. And Mr. Burton, have you noticed anything in the process where government bureaucrat, for instance, likes to pick and choose winners and losers or something along those lines? I'm trying to think something you said. I made a note here, but I can't remember exactly the rest of the note.
Well, strategic sourcing is clearly a very popular initiative right now, and there's nothing wrong with strategic sourcing. When I was in the government, I led an initiative on strategic sourcing back in the 2005 timeframe. The problem is I think the government is pressing rather aggressively to do everything in a consolidated fashion. It may have short-term savings, and that's appealing, but I'm convinced that strategic sourcing, if it's not done correctly, will actually result in higher prices for the taxpayers in the long run. For example, there are many vehicles that are being used right now where the small business participation rate will decrease dramatically once the contracts are consolidated. In the long run, I think there will be fewer small business participants and less competition when these contracts are recompeted, say 5 years from now. And I think, as you know, less competition usually results in higher prices. So I think in the long run, the strategic sourcing effort, taken to the degree it's being taken, will actually increase costs for the American taxpayers and less opportunities for small businesses.
Okay, and I do remember now, you found some abuses in the program, and there's protocols to remedy when somebody hollers foul. There was something you said about a limit on finding justice in the system, I guess.
Well, small businesses really have no recourse. And yes, agencies are simply not following the rules. I was actually, when I moved to the private sector, rather startled by how much noncompliance there is. And when I asked for written justifications from agencies that they need to do by law to support their consolidated procurements, they were unable to provide those justifications. They don't exist. And I think this is rampant throughout all of the agencies. That is disturbing. Second, small businesses, when confronted with that type of situation, really have no choice but perhaps to file a pre-award bid protest, which is very expensive, and oftentimes they don't want to do it, and they feel like it's going to irritate the agency. They probably, if they irritate the agency, won't get the award in the final analysis. So they don't really want to do a pre-award bid protest. That leaves them without any recourse. And I do think there needs to be some type of more informal, independent review available just to look at whether or not the consolidated procurement is justified and whether or not it has a negative and unjustifiable impact on small businesses. That review could be limited, fairly narrow in scope, where the GAO bid protests usually get involved in a number of different issues. And quite frankly, the pre-award bid protest usually results in a negative finding for contractors in situations such as this.
Thank you very much. I see my time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to commend all of the panelists because you gave a very clear picture of a system that seems to have broken down. And Mr. Burton, I wanted to follow up on some of the things that you said about lack of reliable data and lack of an enforcement mechanism. You said that there was a lack of reliable data on how much bundling and consolidation is going on, and that the agencies are not even giving their justification for bundling. And it's hard to even fix the problem when we don't even know how much of it is going on. So moving forward, how can we incentivize agencies to accurately report the data? Is self-reporting the best way to do it? How can we accurately measure the extent of bundling and consolidation that has occurred in the last 15 years?
I think it's a very difficult challenge. The data in FPDS has always not been terribly accurate. What strikes me on this topic is that there is, in many cases, no data. And I think as far as data is concerned, this area has some of the worst data of anything in the Federal Procurement Data System. So we're dealing with a very significant problem. FBDS probably will never have 100% accurate data. But the problem here is the total disregard for the requirements to report bundling. And I think, first, we need to have the responsibility and accountability in agencies centralized in one office. I would recommend that be the senior procurement executive. Right now, there are different people in the agencies responsible for bundling versus consolidated procurements. It makes no sense whatsoever. So I would recommend, A, just one definition. I don't think we need two definitions of bundling and consolidated procurement. And then I think that you need to centralize within the agency somebody to be accountable. And what we did in some instances was actually hold their feet to the fire and have this as an element of their performance appraisal. In some instances, that did get attention. And I think this is serious enough that I would actually be that prescriptive if I were Congress. I would be that prescriptive with respect to holding accountable officials. First of all, having someone that is a single point of contact. And if it's not the senior procurement executive, it still should be a very high-level official within the government. And then to have that official responsible to report to Congress, to have that official maybe judged by their performance in this area for purposes of their performance appraisal. I think that is certainly a place to start. I will say that I think this is going to be a very difficult problem to correct, though, no matter what oversight Congress exercises. But the need for oversight, I think, is very clear.
And what is really evident is that there is really no enforcement mechanism whatsoever at this point. That's what I understand, right? And what kind of enforcement mechanism would there be to ensure that agencies comply on this?
You know, one thing I think is a real challenge, and I noticed this when I was in the government, certain agencies don't necessarily like to say that other agencies are doing a poor job. And I have found that true with the Small Business Administration, which is actually, as you know, headed by a political appointee. And the other agencies in the Federal Government are headed by political appointees. And one thing I found that was very difficult was to get agency political appointees to criticize agencies headed by other political appointees. So that's why I'm recommending that the review and the identification of problems in this area be housed somewhere else. And I think you need to get it out of SBA in the final analysis, and I think it needs to go, and I can't think of any other organization that is viewed as independent and as objective as GAO. And that's why I think GAO needs to set up a separate office to actually conduct these reviews, and in appropriate cases hold the agencies accountable. They do a pretty good job of them.
Mm-hmm. And I was also shocked by the fact that small businesses have so little ability to appeal these actions or to challenge any decision, that they have to demonstrate. It's hard to demonstrate standing or protest in a timely fashion or have a lack of jurisdiction on the part of the protest. Could you expand on that, on how we could fix this?
That is very true. Your points are very well taken. And really, the only recourse that's available to a small business would be what's called a pre-award bid protest. But oftentimes in that situation, the small business does not have a lot of information necessarily to challenge the agency decision to consolidate the procurement. Some people will tell you, though, well, they do have recourse. They can take it to GAO in a pre-award bid protest. These tend to be very expensive. As I mentioned, small businesses are reluctant that, they're worried that there might be some type of retribution if they did follow such a formal procedure, which is very public, and it's very expensive. And what's really disturbing is that the cases that I'm familiar with have resulted in negative decisions for small businesses because an extraordinary amount of discretion is afforded the agencies in making these determinations whether to consolidate or not. And even if the agency can show savings, and they might be able to show savings, I don't think the savings are significant in many cases, and I think that the interests of small businesses should be paramount and should be actually weighted heavier than any secondary savings that might be realized by the agency.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Clark?
I thank you, Chairman Hanna and Ranking Member Meng. And I'd like to thank our witnesses today for sharing your expertise and your testimony. I'd like to take a moment to say that I understand the significance and the gravity of this extremely important issue facing our small business community, and have myself been very vocal on the need to address the inherent disregard for small business opportunities in bundling, especially on minority and women-owned, veteran-owned small businesses. Given the seriousness of this issue, I truly wish this hearing were occurring under normal circumstances, however, with our federal contracting and procurement agencies present here today to hear your testimony. However, the current congressional climate we are confronted with could not be any less ideal and indeed harmful for our small business community in our nation. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, we are now in the 10th day of a Republican-forced government shutdown, which has already cost our still recovering economy $1.6 billion to date at a rate of $160 million daily. In my district alone, the Republican-forced shutdown has cost my small business constituents nearly $800,000 in SBA-approved 7A loans and 504 real estate and equipment loans. These are loans that are needed to sustain and grow small businesses that are the engine of our local, state, and national economy. So I find it ironic that we are having a hearing regarding issues in the bundling process when the very federal government that is at the heart of this discussion is essentially non-operational. Bids that have been submitted are not being processed. Payments for completed work are not being processed. And smaller contractors who don't have the cushion to survive a prolonged shutdown are laying off workers and dipping into lines of credit just to survive. So again, while I understand that this is a very important issue, I'm having a bit of trouble concentrating on the trees for the forest. So perhaps you aren't prepared to discuss this today, but I have a question, a very simple one. Given the current environment, it is critical that we hear and understand what you are hearing regarding the impact of this shutdown on your membership and the damage that it is doing to our small business community. And I thank you, Ms. Dorfman, for including at least your understanding in your comments. But I'd open for our other folks who have testified here today to just share with us, because I think it's critical we put this in context.
May I? Gloria Larkin, representing WIP. We are in our conference, our annual conference right now. So yesterday we had the advantage of having a room full of business women raise their hands and indicate how many companies had received stop work orders, putting their staff, their employees out of work. We are living it right now. I have a client in Tennessee who has an $8 million payment that they're waiting on from the government. They have to lay off their staff because they don't have cash flow to run. So this is hitting us deeper than anyone imagined. My staff, my personal staff in my business, their spouses are employed by the government, and they're wondering if they're going to be able to make house payments now.
If I could just add, I have a member here today who her subcontract was absorbed into the prime because it would, quote unquote, be cheaper. And the other issue that really impacts women especially is that we don't have access to capital. We talk about lines of credit, but a lot of my members can't get lines of credit or loans for their business without the husband's signature, and so they don't have that cushion at all. They can't plan. When you have a shutdown and you need to fill in the gaps, you can't do that if you don't have access to the capital you need. So there's just levels and layers of challenges with this whole shutdown. Thank you.
Yes, I'm seeing Juanita Buford, PTAC of Delaware. And I think that I speak for all the PTACs across the country, but in my state of Delaware, we're seeing similar things. Termination for convenience. We are seeing delay in contract, no task orders issued on contracts that's been awarded, layoffs of staff people by our small businesses. So I don't think that's much different than any other program or PTAC across the country. And we assume it's going to just get worse as it goes on.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Dorfman, you said something I found interesting, and that is that in your written and in your testimony here today, you mentioned that you thought that the whole idea of bundling was somehow misguided, that it might just be to let go away. And if I have that correct, maybe I do not. But I found it interesting. There's almost unanimity in terms of how people feel about the way this is handled. Is it the case that if the rules were actually followed, that there are enough rules in place to do what it is we all want to see done? And I ask anybody can answer that. Or is it an enforcement issue?
I believe a lot of it is an enforcement issue, and there could be improvements upon the language to strengthen the enforcement. what I don't see is a top-level down commitment. Where are the heads of the agencies? Why aren't they saying to their people down below, you must make your small business goals, you must make sure there's due access to small businesses to gather these contracts and perform on them? What people don't really think about is they're thinking, oh, we're going to save money this way, but reality is if you cut out competition, fair market trade, then the taxpayer is going to pay more.
And the word was used, task orders, by Mr. Burton, I think. Was that you? Oh, thank you. That's just fancy. That's a different word for change order, but it's different for you. So, but what we're really describing here is a way for contract officers, this may be overly simplistic, but to make their life easier and actually limit competition by simply giving work to the people that are already in front of them, people that they have experience with, people they know are large enough, therefore providing the least opportunity for problems in terms of the work or maybe in their workload. Is that somehow fair?
I would like to answer that, Gloria Larkin. In about 10 years ago, we were spending about $220 billion, and we had over 100,000 people employed in contracting and acquisition handling that workload. Today, we are spending over $500 billion, and we have fewer, I believe, than 40,000 people in the contracting and acquisition workforce. It's simple math. They have to have larger contracts managed by fewer people. It's not a fact that these folks aren't doing their job. It's a fact that they have too much to do with too large of contracts. So one of the solutions to this is to take a look at our professional contracting and acquisition staff, who are not contractors, by the way. We've gone that route, and we have contractors making decisions about what other contractors are going to get the contracts. Sounds a little crazy in the government contracting market. So it is a matter of having enough professional contracting and acquisition staff employed by the government to manage these unbundled contracts.
Mr. Burton, would you like to speak to that? You get the allegation. I don't need to repeat it. And I'm sure you're right. I just would like your opinion, Mr. Burton.
Let me address the task order issue, because I think this is a very significant issue. Task orders are actual contracts, in effect, that are awarded under an umbrella contract. We see many, many more of these types of multiple award contract vehicles where there is a contract in place, and agencies then submit task orders for products or services under those big umbrella contracts. The GSA schedules are the best example of where you have an umbrella contract, and then many task orders are submitted by various agencies under that. The accountability for task orders is something I'm very concerned about. In 2010, Congress did address this issue in amendments to the Small Business Act, and they made it very clear that written determinations for consolidation are required. What's not clear is whether written justifications are required for task orders under that larger contract. Mm-hmm. And I think that clarity is very important here, because some agencies, I think, are playing games with respect to these definitions, contract versus task order, mm-hmm. and they're saying, well, we can consolidate task orders underneath the umbrella contract.
So what you're saying is that we're basically hurting ourselves by eliminating competition and, in fact, even allowing opportunities for corruption, perhaps.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, I think this is something that can be addressed.
Sure. As an aside, I was in construction for 30 years, did over 3,000 projects, and I've seen this many, many times. So it's a combination of things then. It's not just understaffing, lack of accountability, the idea that we actually let this happen and there's nobody watching over people in a way that makes them accountable for what are billions of dollars worth of expenditures. I'm going to yield to, thank you all, Ranking Member Meng.
This question is for Ms. Buford, but anyone is welcome to answer. Your association has staff that works continuously with small businesses trying to enter the federal marketplace. What is their experience regarding how bundling affects a business's ability to compete for contracts? And if there is a belief that a contract has been improperly bundled, what guidance or advice do you give them?
I'll give you an example. Aberdeen Proving Ground consolidated 4 commands, their IT, which ended up being over $5 billion, something like that. We put a team of 6 small businesses together to go after the small business suite under that consolidated contract. We spent 18 months. When the contract was finally awarded, it was awarded to the large companies. And as of July, they had still not awarded the small business suites. Now, this has been over 2 years for that. What we found is that as we went further and further in the process, modifications kept coming out on this contract. And it was pushing the small business owner further away from competing for it, making it more and more difficult. So they're very aware of the consolidation. I understand that Ms. Larkin has spoke about teaming. That is not the optimal way we'd like to go, but in this environment, we try to counsel a business more on teaming because it's better to get a piece of the pie than none at all. And if I can go back and mention what Mr. Burton said, I also find that as we're having a mass exodus of contracting officers from the federal government, we're also having an influx of very young people taking their place. And contracting takes sometimes decades to master. So you've got to find an increase of protests because people really don't know what they're doing. And with no recourse, as Mr. Burton said, for the small business, when they do try to complain, you know, it's just a big, if I may say, mess on that part. But hopefully that's an example of what we've dealt with consolidation.
Question to Ms. Dorfman. There are various factors that are taken into account when determining when bundling and consolidation are allowed. However, an agency can still bundle or consolidate goods or services if they find that it's necessary and justified. While there are still requirements to procure goods through these methods, have you found that agencies are overusing this tool to circumvent these safeguards that exist to prevent abuses?
Absolutely. It appears that it's become quite textbook to go ahead and set it aside for the big firm without consideration for small firms. And so there's a definite overusage of that.
I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You've given me a really good overview of the problem and the situation. And I have 2 questions. Once a contract is bundled, is there any way to unbundle it? No?
Well, the PCRs are supposed to be looking out for those contracts that are coming off, that their intention is to bundle and pull them down and pick them apart and set aside parts of that for small businesses. The challenge that there are not enough PCRs for the country, and it's not funded well. So if we don't have the right kind of staff, I mean, I think part of the conversation here has been we need more staff, but we need the funding to go with it. And when you look at the IDIQs, that's part of the issue as well, that there will be some contracts that are set aside, and then suddenly there's no funding for that portion of the IDIQ, and the small business is out contracts. So I definitely see some issues.
Mr. Burton?
Early in the process, you can definitely unbundle, and that's the whole idea of having the review and the justification done up front. And that is the remedy to, if the agency feels there has been unjustified bundling, then it needs to unbundle it and uncouple it before the solicitation actually goes on the street.
And you need a mediator, it sounds like, if when small business is unjustly discriminated against in a bidding process, correct?
Well, I think that it would be helpful to have an independent reviewer, and I think you could use that word mediator, somebody outside of the agency process that does not have a vested interest in the procurement process.
Do you have any recommendations for who would do that?
Well, I have struggled with that, and the General Accountability Office, the Government Accountability Office, is the one that occurs to me probably is best positioned to do that. I'm sure there'll be some resource issues in that regard that will be raised as an obstacle, but I think a separate office from the bid protest group at GAO, and there are teams within GAO, and I think the acquisition team might be a very good one to actually conduct this type of independent review.
Okay, and do you think this committee should pursue legislation on bundling and consolidation, and what should that legislation look like or incorporate?
I think that the answer is yes. I think that legislation is required. One thing I found when I was in the government, it did seem that agencies paid attention to actual statute more so than other memos and regulations even. So I do think legislation is required. I think the legislation should actually specify the independent review board or office that will conduct reviews of bundling and consolidation. I think that to simplify things, there should be just one definition. I would use the word consolidation because I think it's broader than bundled. And I think I would just have one definition. And actually, the definitions are not that complicated. They're fairly clear. But to simplify things even more, maybe we should just have one definition. And I think consolidated procurement is what I would go with, because agencies are trying to argue that this isn't bundling. And so therefore, we don't need to have a lot of these protections and justifications and so forth. This is mere contract consolidation, not technically bundling. I think we need to do away with that whole distinction, because consolidated procurements alone are hurting small businesses dramatically. It doesn't have to necessarily be a bundled procurement where the agency has to show that it's actually unsuitable work for small businesses. In most instances, work is suitable for small businesses.
Would you incorporate in that legislation a process where we have that mediator step in case of a protest? Or,
yes,
because I'm not interested in making the government any bigger and putting watchers over watchers. I'm not interested in doing that. It just costs taxpayers money for something, a job they should be doing anyway, right? They should be objective in the way they pursue their. And if it's well, anyway, would you put that in there? Like
yes, sir, I would.
Streamline that process, make it easier for veterans and women and anybody else that wants to protest.
And I would use the word challenge. I don't think I would even use the word protest, because that immediately brings up the formal process at GAO. I think you want this to be much more simplistic. It's just a challenge or with respect to the agency decision to consolidate and reduce opportunities for small businesses. I don't think you have to hire a lot of staff in order to do this simple review, but I do think it needs to be somewhat independent of the actual agency, because my experience is the agency will support the contracting official's decision to consolidate.
Great. Thank you very much, sir, and I appreciate your time here today, all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of things. Oh, no, Mr. I didn't think so. You use the word vested interest, which opens up a whole number of issues in my mind in terms of contracting. And Ms. Larkin, they're understaffed, right? But yet, even though they're understaffed, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem if it's a fundamental problem in terms of how they view their job and perceive the opportunity they have to make their job easier rather than harder, so that I don't think you can lay it all on that. The numbers clearly don't suggest, the numbers suggest that it is a policy that is avoided at all costs, that there's no incentive for them to pursue unbundling or simpler, easier, more competitive numbers of contracts. If that were the case, you don't have to agree with me yet. What do you mean, Mr. Burton, by vested interest? Because one would assume that somebody awarding a contract would have no vested interest, although I personally think that I want to hear your version or anyone's version of why the process is naturally going towards this, something other than just a lack of number of people to do it. Mr. Burton, am I clear in my question?
Yes, sir. I think that the acquisition workforce issue is significant. I do think that that is certainly a major issue here with respect to having fewer contracts to award, having fewer contracts to manage. There's enormous pressure on the acquisition workforce to do things quickly. To strategic sourcing is something that's been embraced by the administration as the #1 acquisition reform agenda item. And there's a lot of pressure to produce with respect to strategic sourcing. That equals consolidated procurements. And all of this combined is giving contracting officers great motivation to justify the consolidation. It's usually done on the basis of cost savings. And in some instances, there may even be some short-term cost savings. What is happening, sir, is that agency officials within the procurement community do not necessarily want to challenge a contracting officer's determination. They are very deferent to the contracting officer. But in most instances, I do not think there's supporting data. I do not think there's actual cost analysis available. And just asking for that information to be produced, I think, will show the seriousness of this problem. But you are in an environment right now, for a number of factors, as you point out, separate and apart just related to the lack of acquisition personnel. But there's a number of factors pressing for consolidation. And that is clearly hurting small businesses. So I think that's why I think Congress will have to be very aggressive on this subject and will have to exercise increased oversight.
Interesting.
If I may, I do think there is a challenge with the lack of workforce, especially now where we're losing so many of seasoned professionals. But I'd like to remind everybody here that an investment in small business, which would mean putting funds into some of these mechanisms to protect small business and ensure small business growth, and the SBA, any of the small business, it's an investment. When you grow small business, you're going to grow employment, you're going to grow your tax base, and it just becomes a win-win-win. So instead of looking at this as going to cost the country, I think this is really key that we invest in small businesses so that we can grow our tax base, we can ensure that we have a growth in jobs, and that, I believe, will turn the country around from an economic standpoint just alone.
Sure.
Thank you.
So there is a momentum, an inertia involved in this that is moving towards moving towards less work for the procurement officer for a whole host of reasons, that by definition, and we don't have to, I don't think anyone would argue this, but we eliminate or reduce competition just by tasking. You're actually saying that someone gets a project but doesn't have to necessarily have competition, and that's a great benefit to the particular contractor, but everybody else who might do it cheaper, better, faster, or who is smaller would have that opportunity if we just bundle it. So in terms of the people it might take, or the outside board to look at this, people it might take to do this work that we would all be happier with if it were unbundled, you could probably, I would suggest that there might be opportunities with the tens or hundreds of billions of dollars we spend, that just the increased competition alone may help pay for an enormous portion of that. That's a conjecture, but what do you think of that?
I'd agree.
Increased competition would be a wonderful thing. In the Seaport E contract, which is the Navy contract, largest bundled contract in the history of the United States, $50 billion since its inception in 2004. Do you realize that 20 companies have shared $29 billion of that contract. There's no competition there.
I think Juanita mentioned that in her testimony too, or in her written testimony.
Thank you.
I could keep you here a little longer, but I mean, we've kind of run through this, and since we do have a couple of minutes, if anyone like to say anything else that maybe a question that I haven't asked or someone else hasn't asked that you find germane and would like to get out there?
Yeah, may I? Yeah. Yeah, Mr. Dorfman, you said earlier that enforcement of subcontracting from a general contractor, they had certain protocols that they had to follow. They put a plan in on how they're going to fulfill that contract, right, like an operational plan or a build plan or a business plan, if you will. All right. And they don't follow it. Is there any penalties for that, would you suggest?
Yeah, there's no teeth right now in that, so they can do that.
Okay, and so Mr. Burton suggested legislation, some things we should put in some legislation. Would you recommend putting some teeth in it to force, what, to force the...
To ensure that they are following the subcontracting plan, that when they have engaged with a small business to be part of the contract, and when the contract's awarded, that they do use that small business for that contract.
Okay, now, in other department, or I'm on another committee, Oversight and Government Reform, and we're investigating government agencies for some abuses of their power. Now, it really comes down to, though, if a contractor is not fulfilling or following his business plan for that particular contract, and the government agency is not enforcing it, don't you think we should have some teeth for that government agency? I mean, it makes sense to me, right? I mean, if they look the other way and choose not to enforce it, which is happening so often in well, that's come to light in the last several months, wouldn't you think that, we should have some recourse? Because right now, all they do is retire and say, thank you, Fifth Amendment.
Right, and there definitely has to be a mechanism to ensure that the small businesses are getting their portion of that contract. So I would agree.
So you'd recommend that we put some teeth into forcing the government agencies to provide proper oversight, which is their responsibility to our taxpayers, correct? As well as the contractor that took that bid.
We do need mechanisms in there that would ensure that the agencies doing their due diligence, as well as the prime contractor living within their the plan, keeping the plan.
Yeah, but there could be changes, and they may find maybe that subcontractor didn't, isn't going to fulfill. They found out something new, and they have to change it. But there should be some protocol for a change, for instance, right? Correct? I mean, legitimate reasons. They could say, well, in this particular case, we can't use this subcontractor. Things change.
Things may change, but unfortunately, this is a systemic issue where it happens frequently, where our small businesses, they fulfill a piece of the pre-contract, the pre-award. They have to go and put together a proposal for the prime contractor. The prime contractor wins the award and then systematically does not use the small business that took the time and money from their pockets. I mean, they're basically robbing the small business, because the small business has paid, has invested lots of money in preparing this, and then they get nothing at the end of it.
So
there needs to be some mechanism in there to ensure that the small business is getting the part of the contract that originally was put there. But so often they just take it in-house.
For small business, we should write some legislation that opens the door for small business and keeps the door open, right? Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
Can I speak to that for a minute?
Sure.
There is some regulations right now for prime contractors to use the subcontractors that are written into their subcontracting plan. And if they don't, they have to give justification as to why they're changing. They can change, but it is already regulations out there supporting that. What I find is that even with the PCRs, who should have oversight over these contracts, when they have a grieving process with the agency, however, in the final analysis, the agency will make the final decision. If we're going to have the PCRs review an agency, we need to give them authority to have final decision on that. But if the contracting officer has the final decision on whether or not this contract is going to go to this company or not, even though I come in as a PCR and tell you that this is really not the way this should go, it doesn't matter. They don't have any authority, the PCRs, over the agency.
And improve the challenge process. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I want to thank Emily Murphy, our Chief Counsel. She does a great job. What's that? Promoting me. Oh, well, then you're promoted. If there are no further questions for the witness, I want to thank you for being here today. 17 years after the committee passed the first law addressing contract bundling, it is simply inconceivable that these agencies are not correctly identifying bundling and consolidating. Bundling and consolidation pose threats to competition and the viability of small business, our small business and our industrial base. So we owe it to the taxpayers to make sure that any contract bundling is justified and mitigated. I look forward to working with Chairman Graves and other members of this committee to address these problems that we learned about today. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We have 5 legislative days. Where's that? Here we go. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.